Hello. I've been looking at some old reports about the suspicion a year ago, or just over a year ago, that Russia had access to the Starlink system. Russia had somehow or other managed to hack their way into Starlink. In modern warfare, information is power, and the ability to communicate securely and effectively is as critical as firepower. And since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, Ukraine has relied on Starlink, the satellite internet service owned by Elon Musk's SpaceX, as the backbone of its battlefield communications. It has been indispensable in facilitating rapid, coordinated action between frontline units, medics, commanders, and drone operators. Yet today the headlines are stark. Russian troops are increasingly using Starlink across occupied Ukraine and even in Kursk. And Ukrainian soldiers, fearing targeted strikes, are now switching off their terminals. This is no longer about mere coincidence or about Russian cunning. It raises deeper questions about supply chain failures, technology loopholes, and whether this is a case of American betrayal. For months, Ukraine's main Directorate of Intelligence has warned that Russian forces have been systematically integrating Starlink into their battlefield operations. Reports suggest that Russian soldiers have acquired Starlink terminals through third parties, purchased on the grey market, sourced from resellers in Europe, or even smuggled from Arab countries. They've intercepted communications and the information that Ukraine has been able to intercept too has revealed Russian troops actively setting up and using Starlink terminals. There's evidence of Starlink-enabled drones and artillery coordination in occupied Ukrainian cities, particularly Avdiivka and Donetsk. And Russian online marketplaces openly list Starlink terminals, with customer service even offering advice on how to avoid detection. A particularly damning revelation is that Ukrainian soldiers have observed Russian forces using Starlink to enhance their coordination in real time, making their assaults more precise and their drone operations more effective. Previously, Russia's military communications were one of its weakest parts, and Russian forces relied on radios, slow, insecure, and prone to interception, and Ukrainian electronic warfare units could disrupt Russian command chains with relative ease. But Starlink has changed the game. Russian soldiers now communicate as seamlessly as their Ukrainian counterparts, and artillery strikes and drone coordination have become faster and more lethal. And reports indicate that in battles such as Avdiivka, Starlink access played a role in Russian forces overwhelming Ukrainian defenders. A Ukrainian battalion commander recently summed up the frustration: "It is something that kills us." Elon Musk has publicly denied that SpaceX or Starlink have directly provided any terminals to Russia. The official stance is clear: we do not do business with Russia. However, this raises critical questions, because if Starlink terminals are being widely used by Russian forces, why has SpaceX not moved to shut them down? If it is possible to block access in Crimea or the Black Sea, why can't SpaceX do the same for Russian-occupied Ukraine? And what safeguards were in place to prevent terminals from being diverted to the Russian military? This isn't the first time Musk's Starlink has been embroiled in controversy. In 2022, he allegedly refused to activate Starlink over Crimea, preventing a Ukrainian attack on Russia's Black Sea fleet. His reasoning? Avoiding escalation. But many in Ukraine saw it as a decision that benefited Moscow. Now, with Russian forces using Starlink on the battlefield, Ukraine faces a harsh reality. The very technology that helped level the playing field is now aiding the enemy. The system cannot be easily geo-fenced, meaning Russian-occupied areas still retain access, and the response from SpaceX and the US government has been too slow or ineffective. The Washington Post has reported on frustrations within the Pentagon, where some officials are beginning to question whether Musk's sympathies lean too closely towards Moscow. The issue transcends the battlefield. It raises deeper questions about the trust, about alliances, about technology governance. Is this an intelligence failure by the US? And given the Pentagon's close ties to SpaceX, why did American authorities not preemptively secure tighter control over the Starlink access? Was the US negligent in assuming that Starlink terminals would not fall into Russian hands? Is there a commercial conflict of interest? SpaceX is a private company after all. Its interests do not always align with those of the US government, let alone Ukraine. Is Musk prioritizing business interests over American responsibilities? And how much control does Washington really have over its own defense contractors? If Ukraine cannot fully trust the reliability of Starlink, should Kyiv seek alternative systems? And the news I've heard is that Ukrainians on the field are closing down their terminals because they know that if they open the terminals, they will be targeted. What are the risks of allowing private enterprises to control vital military infrastructure? For Ukraine, these questions are no longer abstract. When Starlink is switched on, Ukrainian troops get targeted. It isn't a coincidence. It's a serious problem about existence. And immediate sanctions and crackdowns on the grey market, the US and the EU must shut down known resellers, particularly in the UAE and in Europe, and financial tracking of Starlink subscription should be enforced to detect illicit usage. Starlink must develop a stronger tracking system to disable stolen or misused terminals, and geofencing must be improved, even at the risk of disrupting some Ukrainian units. The US should consider alternative satellite networks to reduce dependence on Starlink. NATO and the EU must explore state-controlled satellite options. If the EU is using Starlink, then again, that is no longer safe. Starlink transformed modern warfare, but now it risks becoming Ukraine's greatest vulnerability. If Russian forces continue to exploit Starlink or to hack into Starlink, Ukraine will lose one of its most critical advantages. And if the US fails to intervene decisively, questions about American commitment will only grow. And if Elon Musk doesn't act swiftly and act in the interests of Ukraine, history will be asking whether his technology was a force for defense or for destruction, in the same way as history will now ask whether Trump's pause in intelligence sharing was a pause for defense or destruction. I'm afraid history will judge that Trump has been treacherous and has betrayed his allies. I don't think it's any coincidence that there is this talk about Russian ingenuity. It's about oversight, negligence, and the fragility of modern warfare's digital backbone. For Ukraine, every second counts, and the seconds are ticking away in the wrong direction at the moment. And we've got to remember who uses Starlink, and we've also got to remember the concept of treachery, the concept of treason. And there must soon start to be serious questions about whether Trump is treacherous, whether Trump is treasonous, whether Trump can be trusted. I mean, already, shipments of agreements to buy American defense weapons across Europe have been rescinded in the last 7 weeks because people are beginning to vote with their feet. People and countries are beginning to recognize that the US can no longer be trusted as a reliable partner. That is worrying. So if we look to the east and we look to Putin and we think there is an enemy, we can now look to the west, and we can see another enemy, unfortunately, because America may not be setting out to be an enemy, but it's not a friend. And it's presenting itself as a danger. That needs to change. It needs to change fast.